Right, this morning we're continuing in our study in Nehemiah. Starting our study of Nehemiah, continuing the synthesis. And as you already know, Nehemiah and Ezra and the book of Esther are all fairly contemporaneous. The title of the book of Nehemiah is taken from its main character and traditional author. Chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. You may have remembered from our study in the book of Ezra that in the ancient Hebrew Bible, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah were treated as one book, called the book of Ezra. And they weren't divided until 1448. So much for the title of the book. The author of the book of Nehemiah. Jewish tradition has always held that Nehemiah was the author. Jewish tradition, of course, is based on the first verse of the book. Most of the book is written in the first person, down to chapter 7, verse 5. And in chapter 7, verse 6 and following, it switches to the third person. And in verse 7 of that 7th chapter, Nehemiah is mentioned. So obviously somebody else probably concluded the book. Verse 5, my God put into my heart to gather together the nobles, rulers, people, that they might be reckoned by genealogy, and I found a register of the genealogy of them which came up at the first, and found written therein. It's like a quotation. Verse 6, these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those that had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away, and came again to Jerusalem and to Judah, everyone unto his city, who came with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, so forth. And it's still third person when it's recounting the revival under Ezra, chapter 8, chapter 9, standing off, looking. Just checking out some references here. Chapter 12, 27. Right at the end of the book, it looks as if it switches back to the first person again. 13th chapter. And verse 6. Probably starts with verse 4, actually. He talks about our God. And verse 6, and all this time was not I at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes came I unto the king. And after certain days I obtained leave of the king, and I came to Jerusalem, and so forth. Right? So the book, the large majority of this book is written in the first person, and there are excerpts. Unger, in his Old Testament introduction book, points out that the 7th chapter the bulk of the 7th chapter, the part that we, where it switches there from the first person to the third person, right at that particular point, that's really a quotation from earlier sources, because that's not an eyewitness account, it's a genealogical account. So chapter 7 verse 6 right to the end of the chapter, 73a. So the priests and the Levites and the porters and the singers and some of the people and the Nephilim and all Israel dwelt in their cities. And then the second part of that 73rd verse picks up with the narrative, the eyewitness account. So it's obvious that Nehemiah used historical sources to complement his own eyewitness accounts. Critics, Unger points out, generally regard the author of the book of Nehemiah as the chronicler, and generally relegate the writing of 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah long after the time of the return. They bring it back to about the 3rd century or the 2nd century. So that's the higher critical view, and if you want to read a critique of that, Unger's book is a good one to get for your library. The Old Testament, Introductory Guide to the Old Testament, if you haven't got it already. Baxter strongly supports the Jewish tradition. His statement regarding the authorship is, quote, Nehemiah is certainly the actual composer of much of the book and probably the compiler of the whole. He says this allows for supplementary touches in chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. And verse 23. I don't understand what significance those two verses have, except they may be bringing the genealogy right down to the eyewitness's account to his time. McGee thinks that Ezra wrote the book, so, and he didn't, at least in the source that I used, he didn't offer any support or discussion of the question. So there's probably a difference of opinion. There's a difference of opinion. Most people think Nehemiah wrote the book. Now, moving on to the date of writing and the date of the contents of the book. The date, according to the critics, Unger says, is usually placed at the beginning of the Greek period, about 330 BC. He rejects the rationale behind that. The conservative opinion, generally speaking, is that the book is to be dated in the reign of Darius Nothus, Nothus, Darius Nothus, in 424 to 395 BC.
4
to 395. So the critics generally try to bring it back at least 100 years. McGee has a couple of helpful comments. He says the book of Nehemiah is the last of the historical books. Brings us to the end of the Old Testament, chronologically speaking. Even Malachi is to be placed somewhere in the events of, I think Malachi is mentioned in Ezra. Nehemiah returned about 15 years after Ezra did. And J. Vernon McGee accepts the work of Sir Robert Anderson, the British professor, not professor, he was a professional, the head of Scotland Yard, who worked out the dates of the so-called 70 weeks of Daniel. And the position that McGee takes is that the 70 weeks of Daniel begins with Nehemiah's account. Just hold your finger here and go to Daniel chapter 9. "25. Did I read that?
Going therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem unto the Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, and 62 weeks. The streets shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times."
Right? Now the key part of that verse is the first part. Understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem. Right? Now the great difference between the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is that Ezra, in Ezra's time, the temple was rebuilt, right? Under the first and second return, or between the first and second returns of Ezra, in that 80-year span. And in Nehemiah's time, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt. And that's what the prophecy of Daniel mentioned, that commandment by a heathen king to allow the Jews to actually do that particular thing was to date the beginning of the 70 weeks of Daniel. So that's Daniel 9:25. And they can figure that out right to the day. Sir Robert Anderson says that the decree of Cyrus, which is recorded in Ezra chapter 1 verses 1 and 4, took place in 536 BC. And the decree of Artaxerxes, which occurred in the 20th year of his reign, Nehemiah chapter 2 verses 1 to 8, took place in 445 BC. And that's the year right there, 445 BC, right? That's when the 70 weeks began. So according to this rationale, the first 7 weeks ended in 397 BC. About the time of Malachi. Schofield's note isn't contradictory. He dates the events of the book in the 5th century BC and says, quote, "Nehemiah records the last historical events in the Old Testament, carrying the history to about 430 BC. Baxter says the writing of the book of Nehemiah was completed about 430 BC. He says that Nehemiah's first return took place in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. And the explicit date was March 14th, 445 BC. March 14th, 445 BC. So that was in Artaxerxes' 20th year. The second coming of Nehemiah to the land to check up on the progress was in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, which would have made it 12 or 13 years later, about 432 BC. And obviously, Nehemiah couldn't have written about the happenings that were taking place at the time of his second visit before he had made the visit. So obviously the book could not have been written before 432 BC. Probably was written soon after that because of the detail of the account. I'm going to jump over to the theme and the message of the book. I'll come back and finish these other things tomorrow. Unger says that the message of the book of Nehemiah is that it shows God's faithfulness in restoring his people to their land. And it shows that God uses both great heathen people and anointed spiritual leaders to accomplish his purposes. The title for the book, according to Unger's handbook, was The Rebuilding of Jerusalem's Walls. We've already pointed that out. John Phillips, in his survey of the Old Testament, lumps Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther together under the heading The Return of the Remnant. The Return of the Remnant. All three of these books. Baxter calls the book of Nehemiah the book of reconstruction. And summarizes the message of the book under 6 very interesting and paradoxical phrases or statements. It's good. I think it's probably worth writing down. It says the message of the book, number 1, is that there is no winning without work and warring. There is no winning without working and warring. Secondly, there is no opportunity without opposition. Thirdly, there is no open door set before us. Without there being many adversaries to obstruct our entering it. And fourthly, there is no triumph without trouble. It's not a whole lot different than the first one. There is no victory without vigilance. Number 5. And lastly, there is a cross in the way to every crown that is worth wearing. Nehemiah is a very encouraging guy to read about. He had all kinds of opposition and just kept plugging away. Outlines to the book. Hunger has a 2-part outline. The first 7 chapters are restoration of the walls of Jerusalem by Nehemiah. And in chapters 8 to 13, we have religious reforms by Ezra and Nehemiah. Basically the same outline by J. Vernon McGee, rebuilding the walls, and revival and reform. Same divisions. Baxter has the same, well, almost the same outline, a little bit different division. He makes the first 6 chapters the reconstructing of the wall. And in chapters 7 to 13, he has the re-instructing of the people. That's good. The re-instructing of the people. You think after like 70 years, and some of these old men that came back into the land had seen the first temple, like they were over 70 years old, so they were over 80 years old, because they would have been old enough to understand and see and remember. And it says that when they came back, that they wept. The book of Ezra says they wept when they saw the walls of the first temple, of the second temple, when they thought of the first temple. It was nothing like the first one had been. And yet, like within 15 or 20 years or whatever, the people were just like they are today. In those days, Nehemiah says, I saw in Judah some treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing in sheaves and leading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals. Just completely secularistic, lost all concern for the spiritual aspect.
Says in Titus was this one. But unto them that are defiled and believing was nothing pure.
Yeah.
And in their mind comes defiled.
in that sense, these two books are somewhat depressing. And they need to be read in conjunction with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Malachi is really an eye-opener. You know, the priests were taking third-rate lambs for the sacrifices because they didn't want to destroy the good crops, the good flocks. And it was a hard time. They had enemies living all around them. So they had to be concerned for their own safety and well-being and try to make as much money as possible, sort of thing, for securities. They were concerned about their securities. It's quite a contemporary message. Anyway, before we leave it, Phillips has a three-part outline to the book. In chapters 1 to 7, we have the work of construction. Chapters 8 through 10, the work of consecration. And chapters 11 to 13, the work of consolidation. Listen to his alliteration. Don't write this down because I'll type it up for you. But under the work of construction, we have the prayer and the place and the plan and the problems and the prize and the pole. The work of consecration, we have conviction, confession, and covenant. And consolidating, how it was commenced and how it was completed. He even alliterates the subpoints under that: the distribution of the populace, the descendants of the priests, the dedication of the city, and the dealing with sin. It's good too. He's faithful to the text. So, I'll also give you Schofield's four-part outline to the book. Schofield's outlines are more, generally more difficult to understand or to remember because they're purely logical, right, or chronological. But in chapters 1 to 2:8, we have Nehemiah's permission by Artaxerxes to visit Jerusalem in 445 BC. In chapter 2, verse 9 to 773, the end of chapter 7, we have the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. Chapters 8 through 10, 8:1 to 10:39, we have the great revival under Ezra. And in chapters 11 to 13, 11:1 to 13:31, we have the conditions in Palestine after the remnant had been there for about 100 years. After the remnant had been living there for about 100 years. So we have the end of the Old Testament brings us up to about 350 BC, and Christ isn't born until 4 BC. that calendar. So we have about 350 years in between. That's approximate. So that wasn't a bad outline this time. Talking about the relationship of the book of Nehemiah to other scriptures, comparing it first of all to the book of Ezra. First of all, Baxter says that in Ezra and Nehemiah together we have the temple, we have the restoring of the temple, the worship, the walls, and the people. In Ezra and Nehemiah we have the restoring of the temple, the worship, the walls, and the people. Ezra is the book of restoration. Nehemiah is the book of reconstruction. Unger, on the similarities and dissimilarities of the two books, says that Nehemiah is more civil and secular than Ezra. As you would expect, it deals with the city. Right? The walls, the administration, the legal documents, the politics behind the situation, right? Whereas Ezra is more concerned with the spiritual life and the temple, the religious center. Both of these books, in spite of their differences, are written from a priestly standpoint. Ezra appears in both as a godly reformer. McGee points out that Ezra emphasizes the rebuilding of the temple, stresses the religious aspect of the return, Ezra, he says, emphasizes the priest and the scribe's role in the restoration. The book of Nehemiah emphasizes the rebuilding of the walls, the political aspect of the return. Instead of priests and scribes, this book stresses the nobles and the business people. Schofield says in his introduction to the book of Malachi that perhaps the last book in the English Bible was written a few years later than the history recorded in this book. Perhaps it is a little bit later. It doesn't necessarily have to be, though, because the spiritual tenor of Nehemiah 13 certainly is identical to that of Malachi. Right? Baxter, relating Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, says that Ezra is the book of restoration, Nehemiah is the book of reconstruction, Esther is the book of preservation. By the way, it was during the time of Esther that the Feast of Purim, or Purim, Festival of Lights, was started. I think we'll leave that for today, and we'll finish off with the other parts, notes and lessons, and Christology, and characters and events stuff tomorrow's class. That's it for today.